Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. For those that haven't seen me before, I'm Stuart Chapman, and I'm a retired Chief Superintendent from South Yorkshire Police in England, my old employers. Just a bit of legal stuff. The opinions I give today are my opinions. They're not those of South Yorkshire Police, and certainly not the cruise company. Bit of a health warning as well. I did mention it yesterday. There's no horrible photographs of people being murdered or children being murdered, but I will be talking about details that might be a bit disturbing for you, and I wouldn't be offended if you wanted to leave. I actually have to start with an apology, because I was talking to somebody this morning, and I can actually see it on probably under the Trade Descriptions Act. It takes two when lovers kill, and they actually thought they were coming to a description how to kill your husband, how to commit the perfect murder. And can I say that it's not that at all? It was just a play on words that I did. And I can understand now. Perhaps I need to look at changing the title. When I started writing this presentation last year, there were a couple of jobs that I attended that actually, quite seriously, still remember them like it's only yesterday. The first one was as a fresh-faced young cop with about 2 or 3 weeks out operationally from training school, getting sent with my tutor, the officer that's got the job of looking after keeping you on a very close leash for a couple of months, called Andy Christian, brilliant cop. I'll give his name because it deserves it. And we got a call one summer's afternoon to go to where there was some old housing in Sheffield. We got reports that members of the local community had made a citizen's arrest of a pub landlord, somebody that ran a bar. And when we got there, we found the ambulance service, and in the derelict toilet at the back of the houses was a young girl, about 3-year-old, who'd been seriously sexually assaulted by the pub landlord. And actually we got there just in time to effectively stop him being lynched by the people that had done it. And that was a really big learning point for me, because what my tutor said, he says, this is what distinguishes you from a member of the public. We've got to make friends with him or befriend him. We're not going to be his friends, but we want him to tell us what he's done. So we're going to look after him. So we put him in the police car, took him to the police station, made him a cup of tea, made sure he was looked after. And that's what really occurred to me, that I was different now. I was a police officer. I wasn't just any member of the public. The worrying concern, CID took the job over. We were uniformed cops. He admitted what he'd done. The worrying thing was he'd got a 13-year-old daughter that was severely educationally subnormal, couldn't talk, and we always wondered whether he'd been abusing her as well. We never, well, the CID couldn't prove that, and he got a long term of imprisonment, but he didn't serve his full term because somebody murdered him in prison. The second job was about 3 years later, and I'd just got into CID as a trainee detective, and we got a 4-year-old boy brought to us as a result of information from an outside agency. We have a term in England. His uncle had been mucking about with him, which meant his uncle had been sexually abusing him. Our skills in interviewing children at that time were not as sophisticated as they are today. And his mum, i.e. the person's sister, it was her brother that was accused of assaulting him, together with the child's grandma, came along, and they said he's a liar, don't believe anything he says. He's 4-year-old, we can't believe him. And we couldn't prove it. To this day, I probably think he was telling us the truth. So back of my mind is always, there was a 4-year-old boy back then, maybe an adult now, was being sexually assaulted, and we sent him back to the offender to carry on sexually assaulting him. So that's the background I'm going to go into now. And lovers that kill. And what I mean by that is a famous couple in there, both on the stage and in real life, and didn't work out too well, did it? Are there lovers where people say, I'll do anything for love? Now, would that include murder? Would you allow your partner to coerce you into committing the most horrendous crime possible? There used to be a situation at one time in English law where they used to talk about competent and compellable. In other words, a wife could not be compelled to give evidence against her husband, irrespective of what she did, because she was his property. And that's how English law stood for decades or centuries. But they altered that, and that is different now. So we've got a situation is couples together in love commit the most horrendous crime. And the couples I'm going to talk about will be well known probably to the British audience. And the top two are people known as the Moors murderers, and that's Ian Brady and Myra Hindley from the 60s. And the two at the bottom is Fred and Rose West. And they're a toxic mix. And I, obviously as a police officer, the way that you commit crime doesn't really, the motives don't change, the opportunities don't change, it's the way that you detect that's changed over the decades. And my knowledge of these two couplings came about quite differently. Obviously, I was at school when the Moors murders were active, but as a young detective, I went to a presentation by a forensic psychiatrist who'd examined hundreds, literally hundreds of murderers. And he said that the top two were the most evil people he'd ever examined for legal purposes. He had to talk to them and examine them in order to put paperwork in for the courts and also for subsequent appeals. The second two, Fred and Rose West, quite differently, is when I was at university, I was there with another cop. We went on scholarships called Phil Sullivan. And Phil Sullivan was a superintendent in Gloucestershire. In fact, he was the superintendent in Gloucester where Fred and Rose West operated, when a detective knocked at his door one day and said, I think we're going to have to dig somebody's garden up. And the rest, as you'll see, is history. But it also is quite probably a unique murder investigation because it became a massive investigation. And a few weeks into it, he got a call from Buckingham Palace. And it said Prince Charles would like to come to the incident room. And the future King of England went to a murder incident room to see what was happening. Such was the national interest in that case. And he actually said to Phil, and Phil said, quite a unique situation, you're showing around the future king of the country, around the incident room. And he said his mama was interested, and he was going to report back to his mum to tell her what was going on. And I didn't mention it yesterday, but Queen Victoria took a similar interest in Jack the Ripper. So sometimes the monarch is interested what's going on the street. So they're two different ways that I sort of came into those cases. And we'll now go into detail to talk about them and the lessons that we've hopefully learned from what they did. It's a bit like that film, is it Minority's Report? Can we spot a crime's about to be committed? Well, from what they did, could they have been stopped? In England, there are not many crimes that are known by the location. So I've said the Moors murderers, and the Moors murderers, for obviously those that don't live in England, I'm sorry, my map's not that good. It's the north of England. It's the chain of hills, the Pennines, that are between Manchester and Sheffield, between east and west. They run up the spine of the country. And the Moors murderers operated in the areas around Manchester, towns like Oldham, Ashton-under-Lyne. That's where they got their victims. The actual moor where they, and I'll come into the detail, the relevant piece of moor is called Saddleworth Moor. And there's a motorway that runs across the Pennines. And actually even today, I see the sign that says Saddleworth Moor. A close friend of mine used to play on the moors as a child and says I could have well been playing on the graves. And I'll talk about the graves in a minute. The Fred and Rose West lived at 25 Cromwell Street. And in England, if you say 25 Cromwell Street, they know you're talking about. It's the West. And there's not many other killers, perhaps Jack the Ripper, Whitechapel, and there's a famous or infamous murderer in London at 10 Rillington Place where John Christie killed a load of people in a house there. So there's not many places when you talk about a murder, it's known by the location. You may got some in America or Canada. That's Cromwell Street, and that's the basement, which was effectively the torture chamber. But the West didn't just operate at the house. They operated around Gloucester, Cheltenham, and the lovely rural area that's around there, and that's where a lot of their victims were found. Or were not just found, that's where they were disposed of as well. So let's look at Brady and Hindley. Ian Brady, or actually was born Ian Stewart in Glasgow in 1938. Single mum, but she put him in foster care, and she was a real good mum. She used to go and see him nearly every day. Very bright lad. As soon as he started school, he went to a school for children of above average intelligence, but then warning bells started to ring, particularly when at 10 he was bragging off about the first cat that he'd killed. And then he started to abuse young girls. It got to a point that his foster parents said, we can't control him. By this time, his mum had moved to Manchester. She'd married somebody called Brady, and he went down there and he took his stepfather's name, Ian Brady. And he continued on his move through the criminal world, and by the age of 16, he was in a Borstal, actually not too far from where I live in Yorkshire. And while he was in the Borstal, he raped a 16-year-old boy who he said had grassed up on him. But he then tried to work hard. He got qualifications in accountancy or bookkeeping. And when he came out of prison, he actually got permanent employment. He got his nose down, and he actually cracked on. He learnt German. He got an interest in German. He bought a motorbike. He got interest in photography. And he got a job in at the admin offices of a chemical firm in Manchester. And that's where Myra Hindley comes along. Myra Hindley, she was born in 1942. Her dad was incredibly strict with her and brutal. He was a former parachute member of the parachute regiment. Not sexually abusive to her, but physically abusive. She had to learn to fight, literally her own corner. She had to learning to fight. So much so, at the age of 5, she went to live with her grandma and stopped with living with her grandmother for the rest of her life. Although she still had contact with her parents. She went to college, she got some qualifications, became a typist secretary, and went to work at the same chemical firm as Ian Brady. She was infatuated with him, but for the first 12 months, he ignored her. He wasn't interested. And then she could have escaped. She actually got opportunity to go and work for the military in Germany, but then Brady started talking to her, and that was it. The coupling was there. She changed the colour of her hair to the blonde that she was known by. She became the subject of his photography, which probably would describe a bit risque, some of the photographs he took. And they decided to commit the perfect crime, which was going to be robbery to start with. He couldn't own a gun because he'd got a criminal conviction, he'd been in prison, so she joined a gun club in order that she could have a gun so they could commit a robbery. And that would have been okay, actually, if they'd stuck at that, but then their interest changed to children. And they started to read books about paedophilia, and they decided how they could commit the perfect crime of murdering a child. By this time, Brady had moved in to the grandma's address, and they were both living with Myra Hindley's grandma. So they decided that what they would do is that he could drive a motorbike, but he couldn't drive a car. She'd got a car. At this time, she was also having an affair with a police officer, and she actually applied to join the police. And Brady wanted to join the police because that would be great, because she'd have inside knowledge, but that fell to the one side. So they decided what would happen is that Myra Hindley would go and engage children in conversation. She would get them in a car, and then she would take them up onto the moors where she'd be joined by Brady, and they would murder the child. He would sexually abuse them, and they would bury the child. And that's what they started to do. That's Pauline Reed, who was 16-year-old. She was on her way to a dance, and Myra Hindley stopped and told her that she'd lost a pair of gloves, and would Pauline come with her and actually look and search for the gloves. And she got in the car and very quickly took her up to Saddleworth Moor, where she was joined by Brady, and she was murdered and sexually abused and buried. The next one is John Kilbride. John was working at the market, Nashton under Lyne, although he was 12-year-old, helping with vegetable stalls, earn a bit of pocket money. When he set off to walk home from the market, the same MO again. Myra Hindley stopped. I'll give you a lift home. Can you come and help me find these gloves that I've lost? And Brady followed up onto the moors. There's a police magazine that it's no longer in publication in the UK called Police Review, and there used to be a retired officer used to write in that magazine, C.J. Rolfe, and he actually stopped Brady and Hindley in a car, a routine check, and they got the documents and he let them go. And to his dying day, he wondered whether there was a child in the boot of the car. He could never know whether that actually happened. So we've got John Kilbride killed. That's Keith Bennett. He was on his way to his grandma's, and again stopped, helped me look for the gloves, up onto the moors, and he was killed. The one that most people remember in the UK is Leslie Ann Downey. And she was at a fairground on Boxing Day, day after Christmas, in 1964. In those days, it was probably all right for a 10-year-old to be would you say? Obviously not for her. And they took Leslie Ann Downey. But this time, the MO was different. They took her back to his grandma's house and they tortured her. And not only did they torture her, they recorded it on a tape recorder. And there's some of the words: "Don't undress me, will you? I want to see my mummy." And the investigating officer for the case, when it was eventually solved, had to play the tape to Leslie Ann Downey's mum so she could identify her. And he said it was probably the most difficult job in his entire career. It was also played to the jury at the subsequent court case, and I think obviously just if there was never any doubt there was going to be a guilty verdict, playing the tape I think was their undoing. The final victim was that lad, Edward Evans, 17. He was gay, and Brady was bisexual, and they went and found, Brady went out, found Edward Evans, and took him back to the grandma's house, where they bludgeoned him to death. And Grandma was in bed upstairs Saturday night, and she said, "What's all that noise?" And they said, "Oh, we've knocked record player over." They probably killed more, but they're the 5 that are attributed to the Moors murderers. So how did they get caught? Well, they were trying to recruit a third person to the gang. And in fact, it was Myra Hindley's brother-in-law, the guy that was married to her sister. And he thought he was being recruited to commit a robbery. And he was quite happy to do a robbery. But they called him across to the house where they were killing Edward Evans, and he was aghast, shocked. And he said he didn't want anything to do with it. That's him, David Smith. So what he did, when he got away that night, he went and told his wife, "You'll not believe what I've just seen, what your sister's involved in." And they didn't leave their apartment because they thought, well, what happens if Brady's outside waiting for me? They'll kill me. So they waited till daylight, and they rang 999, which is your 911. The police came, they took them to the police station. They'd heard Brady and Hindley talk about having a briefcase or a suitcase where they put all the evidence, and it was kept at a railway station, which is important because the following morning when the police went to the house and Edward Evans was trussed up and dead in a bedroom, the actual cops went as the 1964 equivalent of Amazon delivery men. They went with brown overalls and knocked on the door with a parcel. And they opened the door and they charged in, and they found Evans dead, and they locked Ian Brady up, but they didn't lock Myra Hindley up because she said, "I've not done anything, it's him." And they took Brady away, and for several weeks she was out free. I'm going and visited him in prison. But then they found the suitcase, and it was in the left luggage office, what is now Piccadilly Railway Station in Manchester. When they searched the house, they found the slip when you used to have a piece of paper for a luggage locker at a railway station. And there they found photographs, because Brady had photographed some of the victims. And they also found where some of the victims were buried. So at that point, they were charged with 3 murders. They were charged with Edward Evans in the house. They found the body of the little girl, and they'd got the tape for Leslie Ann Downey. And they found the body of John Kilbride. So that meant that Pauline Reed was still outstanding, and Keith Bennett at that time was still outstanding. So they were charged with 3 murders. They eventually brought Myra Hindley into custody. And they were very uncooperative with the police, but the police thought, well, we've got sufficient evidence, we'll charge them. So they were remanded for that. So I'll park that for a while, and I'll come on to the West. Slightly different with the West. We'll start off with Fred. Fred was born in 1942 in a little village called Much Markle, down on the edge of the Cotswolds, Herefordshire. He was one of 8 children, not that bright, idle, dim he was described at school. But when his dad was a farm labourer, when he was on the farm, his dad made him work really, really hard. It was at school he wouldn't work. But to give you an idea of the family, by the time he was 12, his mother was having sex with him. But incest went on in the family because his dad was having sex with his sisters, and Fred was also having sex with animals. So that's Fred West. He was badly injured in a road accident, a motorcycle accident, when he was 17. He was unconscious for weeks, so he'd got brain damage. That brain damage was added to when he was 20, because he tried to indecently assault a young girl on a fire escape at the back of a youth club, and she pushed him over the top of the fire escape and hit his head again, but obviously not hard enough because he lived. So that's Fred as a background, an awful, horrible young man that had got lots of form for abusing women. And what about Rose? Rose, Lex as she was, here's an interesting one for you. When her mother was pregnant with her, her mother underwent electroconvulsive therapy because she'd got mental illness. So when Rose was born, she was born already with some mental issues. She lived with mum and dad. Dad was sexually abusing Rose, and then she managed to get a job in a baker's shop, Rose, where at the bus stop, when she used to go home at night, she met Fred. And at first she was repulsed by him, by his behaviour and his appearance, but very slowly he won her over. And she agreed to go and be the nanny for his children. And I have to do this a bit out of order. I've looked at doing this different ways to explain Fred's lifestyle. But Fred was he'd been living in Glasgow with his first wife and 2 children, and he split up from her and came back down to Gloucester. So I'll explain that in a bit more detail, but I wanted to say how they got together. So Fred's wants a nanny. He gets Rose, but Rose is more than a nanny, and very quickly he's having sex with her, and actually he's also sending her out on the streets as a prostitute. So that's our couplings. So let's, the West victims. There is no way in the time we've got today that I can go through all the victims that the West. So I want to give you a sampling of the people that they murdered. So I said that he went up to Glasgow with his wife, Rena Costello, and Rena was already pregnant when he met her and married her. She'd had an affair with a bus driver in Glasgow, and that produced a mixed-race child called Charmaine. Fred had said it was his baby, so how to explain that to family and friends, they said that they'd lost his baby and they'd adopted a child that was mixed race. But then they had their own child, Anne-Marie. So he's in Scotland with his wife, Rena, and then Rena's having sex with the men, Fred's having sex with the women, so they split up, and he comes back down, and he brings a friend of his wife's, Anne McFall, down to be the nanny, because Rose isn't the nanny by this time. Rose comes into the picture shortly. And she becomes infatuated with him, and she gets pregnant. And then suddenly, 8 months pregnant, she disappears. Then he tells people she's gone back to Glasgow. Do we think she's gone back to Glasgow? Probably not. Well, we'll come to that in a minute. That's Charmaine. That's the mixed-race child that Rena was pregnant with when Fred married his wife. She's the child of the bus driver. By this time, Rose is the nanny. She's living with Fred, and she doesn't like Charmaine. Fred's in prison for one of his regular visits to prison for, on this occasion, motoring offences, and she murders Charmaine, Rose, because she don't like her. I would say Rose was the most evil out of the two, to be quite honest. But you think is, well, didn't somebody miss? She's at school. Well, she told the school that she'd gone back to Glasgow. The school never bothered to contact Glasgow to see whether she had gone to a school in Glasgow. She'd had repeated visits to the hospital with non-accidental injuries, but at that time the hospital was not under a duty to report them. So we've got a picture there, and we're not talking in 60s, we're talking 1980s here that's not reported. So Charmaine, so Rose puts her in the basement of the house until Fred comes out of prison, then Fred buries her. So she starts to build up the number of bodies in the house. But Rena's in Scotland, and although she's been an absent mum, she is wondering what's happening to her daughter. So she comes down to Gloucester to look for Charmaine. And so Fred says, I'll tell you what, she's at school, why don't we have a run out into the countryside? So he texts his wife, or first wife, for a run out to Muchmartle, where he was brought up. And guess what? Rena never came back in the car. She stopped in Muchmartle, under the ground, where he put her. The house that they ran at 25 Cromwell Street, shall we say it was an open house? Rose was taking her clients there from prostitution. They also let some rooms out to men who had women back to the house. And that young lady there, Linda Goff, she was the girlfriend of one of their lodgers, but when they said they didn't want to go out with her, Fred and Rose sexually abused her, then murdered her. And the mother of Linda Gough came looking for her. And actually, when she came looking, Rose was wearing her clothes. And she said, oh, she was here, but she's gone. But she was part of the group of girls that were transient, that were moving round. The parents never even reported her to the local police. So Linda was dead, and she was in the basement under the floor. So I'll give you a flavour of the sort of ways that Fred and Rose were killing people. That's one of the daughters, Heather. And Heather got to the age of 16, and she tried to get a job working in a holiday resort to try and escape because she was fed up having to have sex with her mum and dad. And so when they thought she didn't get the job, and they thought she was getting a bit risky because she might tell the police, they murdered Heather. So they murdered her daughter as well. So they murdered his ex-wife, he's murdered his half-daughter, he's murdered his real daughter, and as well he's murdered other girls. That's a sampling of some of the people that they murdered. But he lived in Glasgow for a while, and Fred was an ice cream man, and he was known to have young girls in his ice cream van as he toured the city. Glasgow had a record of lots of missing girls that have never been found. Fred had an allotment, a garden, we call them allotments, away from his house, where he would cultivate, well, not a lot actually, because it was overgrown, but he had a shed, and people said he used to take young girls back to the shed at night. And he had a bit of a flower garden that he said to people, that's my special garden. When he was arrested, it would have been obvious to go and dig that garden up. Well, they would have done if it had not been under hundreds of thousands of tons of concrete, because they'd put a motorway over the top of it. But there's a suspicion that there's probably bodies under there as well. So that gives an idea, a flavour of what they were up to, the Wests. I want to mention something about this lady, and I'm quite happy to give a name. She survived, very brave lady, Caroline Owen. And she applied to an advert for a nanny required. And when she got to the house, she very quickly decided she wasn't going to do it because she was fearful what might happen to her. So she left. So Fred and Rose knew where she waited for her boyfriend at a bus stop, and they went and kidnapped her and took her back to the basement, where they both raped her repeatedly over one night and beat her up. She was very clever in the sense, she said, I love it. Can you do this to me again if I come back? So they released her, and she managed to escape and went and told her mum what had happened. And she gave a statement to the police, and they were both charged with rape, kidnap. Then she withdrew the statement because she didn't want to go to court. So they didn't get convicted of those offences. So distraught was she when she found out what they'd done, she tried to kill herself because she was embarrassed. If she'd gone through with it, those crimes had been stopped. She actually went on to set a foundation up where she talked about, or talked to women who'd been the victim of sexual assault, is what to do and the importance of evidence and taking that forward. And she subsequently appeared as a major prosecution witness. Sadly no longer with us, she died of cancer a few years ago. But Caroline Owen, very brave lady. But how did they get caught? Well, that's the guy that went and said, we need to dig a garden up, boss, the detective superintendent, John Hope. And they started to dig the gardens up at 25 Cromwell Street and the cellar. And before that, they'd lived on the next road at 25 Midland Street, and they had to go and dig it up there. And they found bodies and parts of bodies, but not fingertips, because he always took the fingertips off to stop identification. So you couldn't fingerprint them. But we've got DNA by then. But the trouble is, we started off with an investigation that Gloucestershire Police, which is one of the smallest police forces in the UK, hadn't got the budget for. So they approached the government and said, look, we're now getting phone calls from police forces all over the UK, and in fact abroad, saying that could be one of our victims, our missing persons. And the government of the day said, tough, sort it out yourself. So you've got the smallest force in the country running probably the biggest murder investigation in the country. So John Hope, an absolute gent, did a fantastic job. That's the fields up in Muchmartle. They had to use dogs and ground-penetrating radar, where they found Rena's body and Anne McFall's body and some other body parts. But a lot of them were found at Cromwell Street. And it was a job for forensic archaeologists to start putting the bodies back together, the skeletons. The pathologist, Bernard Knight, led the forensic team and did an absolutely amazing job. that black box. That's a cafe in Cheltenham or Gloucester, which has again been recently the subject of a cold case where one of the waitresses disappeared, where Fred used to go, and they dug the cellar up there, but they didn't find anything. The forensic work was incredible, and a lot of it goes down to a guy called the Tooth Fairy. Was Dr. David Whittaker from the medical school at Wales, University of Wales, who was an expert in teeth, as you'd expect. That's why he lectured at the dental faculty at the college. But what he amazed the police by, and that's why they called him the Tooth Fairy, is what he could tell from a tooth. He could talk about age, he could talk about illnesses that they'd had, and he built up a picture of the potential victim, and they could then start matching that to descriptions they'd got of victims from all over the country. But he was also a pioneer in superimposing, that's not one of the victims, that's just an example, where they took the skulls, they took the photograph of the missing person, they superimposed it, and they could say whether that was the person. So it was one of the early cases in the UK where they used superimposing photographs. So he again was a real hero as far as the investigation's concerned. The trials, that's the assizes in Crown Court, the higher level court, criminal courts that we have in the UK. That's where the Ian Brady and Myra Hindley went to, and they just talked rubbish in their defence. As far as Leslie Ann Downing, miraculously these two men just pulled up at the house and brought this young girl in and said, "You want this young girl?" and took her away. They just talk rubbish. They wouldn't tell the police where the two bodies were, Pauline Reed and Keith Bennett. So they were very uncooperative, not nice people, as we've said. And it took the jury just minutes to decide they were guilty, and they were sentenced to life imprisonment. That's Winchester Crown Court, which is, anybody knows the south of England, is a few miles away. It's in Hampshire, and it's a few miles away from Gloucester. The view was they wouldn't be able to get a fair trial in Gloucester, so they moved it to Winchester. In my view, they wouldn't be able to get a fair trial on earth, but legal system in Britain, they moved it a few miles away. And Fred and Rose, by this time, weren't talking, and they were going to operate what's called a cutthroat defence, where they were going to blame each other. But the complication of that is Fred decided he didn't want to go to court, so he committed suicide in Birmingham prison on New Year's Day. I talked about John Bennett, the senior investigating officer. Although it was New Year's Day, he got all his team out on New Year's Day, and he got them to go and speak to the relatives of the victims, because he didn't want the victims to hear it on the TV news that Fred West had killed himself. That's quality, as far as I can see, in a senior police officer. So Rose went to court, and she made the mistake, despite her defence lawyers saying, "Don't get in the box, Rose. Just say nothing. It's the prosecution's job to prove it. You're saying Fred's done it all. They've got to prove that you've done it." Luckily, that Fred had died because he was mentally subnormal, as well as having a lawyer sit on the interviews. In the UK, we have a role that's called appropriate adult, and they sit in with children, or they will sit in with adults that have got learning difficulties. They have a duty of confidentiality from anything that's said outside the interview when the person's alive. But as soon as Fred killed himself, his appropriate adult could then go and give a statement to the police that everything that Fred had told her in confidence. So they've got her, they've got all the forensic evidence, and they've got Caroline Owen that goes and gives evidence about what happened to her, what Fred and Rose had done to her. So actually, I think it was quite good advice to give Rose not to get in the box, but so arrogant is she ignored the advice of her defence counsel, and she got in the box, and Brian Levinson QC, who prosecuted her, just tore her apart. That was useful to Brian Levinson, because anybody in the audience from the UK, his previous major case had been trying to prosecute Ken Dodd, the comedian, for tax evasion, which he'd lost. And he had that label, but he went on and he just tore her apart, and surprise, surprise, the jury convicted her. And she went to Durham Prison, and have a guess who she became her best friend at Durham Prison? Well, the one on the bottom right previously had blonde hair, and that's Myra Hindley, and they became firm friends at Durham Prison. So they're two of probably the most infamous pairs of child killers that we've ever had in the UK. But there were common themes, and that's the killers as children. We set up multi-agency safeguarding hubs where we brought different agencies together. But there's a common theme. There's missing girls. They're the victims of abuse when they're children. They abuse their own children. With the two men, there's abuse of animals. They both commit offences against animals. They're the red flags that we need, as investigators, start to think about. Well, if somebody comes and says, there's a young lad on our street and he's torturing cats and he's got a unnatural interest in young girls, they're the sort of things that they were doing. And hopefully people now do that and the authorities will take notice. So lessons learned, we now have non-accidental injuries. There's a duty among schools, hospitals to notify the police or other authorities that they've got concerns. Major work on missing persons. I did a video, I was a instructor at training school about abuse children in the 80s. I won an award for that. So that's my interest continued. You know, I'd always got an interest in how we detect. And there's a lot of interest in that. And hopefully we have got a lot better. But have we? Because people from the UK might recognise those photographs. And that guy on the top is Ian Huntley, and that's his girlfriend, his Maxine Carr. And that's Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman, no relation, the two young girls in Man United tops. He grew up in a town, an East Coast town in England called Grimsby, where he was known to have an interest in young girls. And he'd been arrested and interviewed loads of times, but it was never proved that it was abusing young girls. He applied for a job to be a school caretaker in another area of the UK, but he used his mother's surname, and the agencies didn't match the details up. So we've got somebody who's got a history of a unnatural interest in young girls, and well, let's make him a school caretaker at a junior school. And that's where, on school holidays, they were walking past the school, and he kidnapped them, and he murdered them, and abandoned their bodies. And Maxine Carr with his girlfriend, who actually gave him an alibi for it, and thankfully they managed to prove it. So the system isn't watertight, and it still happens. And that I go back again to say it's important that we all have, if we have any suspicions that there is child abuse, we need to do something about it. And I want to finish with that one at the bottom, and probably a lot of you will, if you're even from England, might not know that one. And the story I want to tell you there is on a Sunday morning at about 10:30 in September 2021. It was the 18th of September. I was driving somewhere with a friend. We were going out for the day, and the phone rang, and it was my son. And he said, "Dad, can you bring me a change of clothes to work?" My son's a police officer. But he said, just go to he's got his own house. Well, I said, haven't you got a set of clean uniform? I'm going out. Like you do to your kids, even though they are in the 30s. No, Dad, I need civilian clothes. I need some tracky bottoms and a T-shirt. Can you bring them to the police station? What for? I can't tell you. So I drop my friend off who I'm going out with and go back to his house, my son's house, and get him a T-shirt and a tracksuit. And I drive to the police station where he worked, which is only about 6-7 miles from where I live. And literally within half a mile of the police station, you can't move for police cars with blue lights on and scenes of crime and everything. So I go up to the police station, and he's looking fairly shocked, my lad. And I said, "Why? What's happened?" And he says, "Well, at 7 o'clock this morning when we came on duty, they said, can you go down the road?" Literally, they could have walked rather than get a police car and go. And 3 young in-service officers had gone down the road, and there was a paramedic stood ashen-faced outside a house talking to the guy, Damien Bendel, the guy on the left just there, who was clean, he'd no marks on him. The paramedic said, "Can one of you come in the house? I need to certify life extinct." There must be somebody else in the house, because if he hasn't done what you're going to see, somebody else must be in there because there's lots of blood. So my son went in the house with the paramedic, where he found, I'm not going to give surnames, Terry, who is the mum. That's Lacey, her daughter. That's John Paul, her son. And that's Connie, who was a school friend of Lacey, and she was having a sleepover at the house the night before Damien Bendel murdered them all in separate rooms and raped Lacey. And he was clean because he'd showered and put a change of clothes on. And he thought, I'll take to somebody and I'll talk to him. And obviously my son grew up in a household of two police officers. My late wife was a police officer. So at the back of his mind, he'd had reinforced. And if you think back to the 1970s, when I went to my first job involving a child, it's about being professional. Craig, my son, would have liked to have taken his head off, but he didn't. He made friends with him. And he went to the hospital with him while he was treated. He'd actually he'd made a feeble attempt at stabbing himself. And he tried to play the I heard voices card. But thankfully at Derby Crown Court 12 months later, he pleaded guilty to murdering those three. Incredible impact on my son. But that happens every day of the week across the world with police officers doing that. And my son's got kids similar age, and they simply do have to get on and do the job. But it's about being professional. But again, it was down to an error in the system, because Terry had met Damien on a dating site, and he actually lived in the south of England, a town called Swindon. And he was under the probation service, having come out of prison, including for domestic violence with partners in Swindon. And the probation service, a very junior member of the probation service, feel quite sorry for her, she didn't pass that information on to the probation service in the north of England where he lived, because if they had, they would have warned Terry not to have him in the house. So the system is still not waterproof. It just doesn't work every time. And that's why I do continually say to people, it might be a neighbour, it might be a friend, but if you suspect that there's child abuse going on, it's worth being wrong and letting the authorities have a look at it. They're the memorials. That at the top was Cromwell Street, and it's now a park. That's the Moors, because of course we've two bodies outstanding. And there was a few years ago, can I say the Moors murderers are both dead now, they played, I think, with the police, and they said, we'll help you find the bodies. They did actually find the body of Pauline Reed, but Keith Bennett was never found, and up to a dying day, his mum always wanted to know where her son was. So somewhere, potentially, under the Moors, and every year you'll get, well, all year round, at the side of the Moors Road near Saddleworth, you'll get floral tributes. And that's the example when the police were trying to find the bodies. It's not a particularly cheerful subject, I know, but I hope it's one that you'll take away, and the message to take away, it's happening out there all the time, child abuse. Okay, thanks very much indeed. I'm back next week, and I'm doing National Killers, which is about terrorism. So there's nothing about killing your husband in that one either, okay? So it's, and then, so I've got another two to do, and the next one is National Killers.